Did you know that the Dutch colonial army fought for over 40 years in Aceh, a region located in the northern tip of Sumatra Island, now part of Indonesia? During the 19th century, the Dutch were expanding their influence in their colony, the Dutch East Indies, and this led to a conflict with the Aceh Sultanate. Thinking it would be a quick affair, it dragged on for more than 4 decades. The Dutch claimed the war finished in 1913. But did hostilities ever end? In this video, you're gonna learn why it took the Dutch so long to subdue the people of Aceh. Keep watching. Good to have you back on the channel. If you're new, I'm Stefan, I'm a Dutch history teacher and I like to make videos about history. If you find it interesting, consider subscribing and hit that notification bell. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company, Dutch abbreviation VOC, was founded with its main trading territory, the East Indies, now Indonesia. Over the course of the centuries, the VOC suffered from corruption and the inflexibility to adapt to new commercial interests. The VOC went bankrupt in 1799. In 1816, the Dutch territories in the East Indies were given back to the Dutch after a brief British occupation. This time it was the Kingdom of the Netherlands that took control of the area. Over the course of the 19th century, the Dutch undertook many bloody campaigns to pacify the areas. For this, they used their colonial army. The Dutch colonial army was named the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army. In Dutch, we say Koninklijk Nederlands Indisch Leger, or use the abbreviation KNIL, K-N-I-L. It consisted of European and indigenous soldiers. Around 1900, the ratio of European and indigenous was 40 to 60. Several thousand West Africans served in the army as well. So why did the Dutch wage a war in Aceh? Well, during the 19th century, the Dutch undertook many bloody campaigns to expand their influence in the Dutch East Indies. In other words, to make their colony bigger. Now, the Aceh Sultanate had managed to retain its independence so far. With Dutch influence expanding, the Aceh rulers feared that one day a military confrontation seemed imminent. And this military confrontation became a long war that lasted for over 4 decades, although some historians claim it lasted for over 70 years. One historian claims the following phases you see right here. The war took place in Aceh Besar and its capital Kota Raja. The region had a strategic position near the Malacca Strait. After the opening of the Suez Canal, this strait became the gateway to Southeast Asia. There was a lucrative pepper trade in Aceh. In 1824, the British and the Dutch signed the Treaty of London, where the British gained Malacca and the Dutch Bengkulu on Sumatra. This brought the Dutch closer to the Sultanate that was ruled by Teuku Ibrahim. Now do notice that Ibrahim did not have all the power in the Sultanate of Aceh. He had to share this with local rulers that functioned as warlords and landowners. According to Islamic law, the land was in the hands of individual farmers, but hulu balang, local heads, were allowed to take land that was not used. And this resulted in a complex hierarchy of territorial jurisdictions. Now the Dutch feared that Ibrahim might seek support from the British or the French. He even tried to get support from the Ottoman Empire and offered dependency. In 1857, the Dutch signed a treaty of peace and friendship with the Acehnese Sultanate. However, the border they determined was located further north, and as a result, Acehnese ports came under Dutch influence, and this created animosity. In 1871, the Dutch and the British signed the Sumatra Treaty. The Dutch ceded the Gold Coast, a portion of contemporary Ghana, to the British. In turn, this gave the Dutch a free hand in the whole of Sumatra, Aceh included. There were also economic agreements. What is important to know is that the Dutch from now on were obliged to combat Acehnese piracy, because yes, the region was a hotbed of pirates that attacked merchant ships, and now the Dutch had the task to combat this. That year, the Dutch had already sent a warship to the area as a show of force. In the meanwhile, representatives of the Sultanate, they looked for allies, and when the Dutch found this out, they were ready for war. The Dutch cabinet, in agreement with King Willem III, gave the Governor-General in Batavia on Java permission to launch an attack. But did the Dutch really fear foreign competition? Well, Dutch historian Piet Hagen wrote the following about it. The fear of foreign interference was little more than a pretext to justify military intervention. Italy immediately announced that it had no ambition whatsoever with regard to Aceh. Rumors of German and French advances were also unfounded. For the Netherlands, there was no turning back. 2 Dutch warships left Java for Aceh on March 7, 1873. The cannons of these ships fired its first shots on the 26th of March. The Aceh War had begun. The Sultanate was not prepared for war. The palace, the Kraton, was only manned by a few thousand men, and the defensive works lacked much. But the Dutch were not prepared very well either. On the 5th of April, the Dutch went ashore with 3,800 men led by General Major Köhler. An additional 1,100 laborers, known as coolies, and 220 Indonesian women to cook and to, convert the soldiers. They also came ashore. Part of the troops were equipped with a new Beaumont rifle, but had not received proper training yet. The first expedition became a massive failure. The Dutch lacked proper maps. Commander Köhler got hit and died. Its successor, Colonel Ealdert Christiaan van Daalen, ordered an attack on the main palace, the Kraton, on 16th of April. But the defenders managed to keep them at bay. With the loss of 19 men and 400 wounded, the Dutch left Aceh on the 29th of April. The second expedition. On the 9th of December 1873, a second group landed on Aceh, led by General von Swieten. With 650 soldiers, 3,300 forced laborers and 1,000 servants, 250 women, they traveled with 45 ships and had over 70 artillery pieces. Because of a cholera outbreak, 80 men died en route and later another 150. Von Swieten ordered a bombardment that lasted for weeks. They captured the main mosque and stormed the Kraton. Since the Kraton was under siege for weeks, most of the Acehnese warriors had either left or were too sick to continue the battle, and thus the Dutch emerged victorious. They conquered the Kraton, abolished the Sultanate, and claimed the war won. And there you have it, the Aceh War of 1873. Oh wait, no, because the war did not end. The Dutch had considered the war over, but they had no idea what they had gotten themselves into. See, they believed that the subservient areas would submit to Dutch rule as well. But rebellion continued. With over 1,700 men killed, many also due to disease, more continued to die. And of the 500,000 inhabitants Aceh had, only 25,000 lived in Dutch-controlled territory, which was around 40 square kilometers and impossible to defend. Acehnese warlords that were divided before now felt more united than ever. The Dutch had established small bentengs, fortresses, around Kota Raja. When Dutch soldiers ventured outside on muddy roads, they were prone to guerrilla attacks. With their blue uniforms, white socks, and long rifles, they were easy targets against the fanatical Acehnese guerrilla warriors. It went like this. At every bamboo grove, behind every Sawa dike, groups of Acehnese were shooting. Repeatedly, with terrifying war cries and waving klewangs and renchongs, they approached the columns very close. The fanatical champions, who still wanted to enter paradise today, as Syah, hero of faith, were dressed in white and threw themselves with a longing for death on the Dutch bayonets. They had consecrated themselves to death in the mosque in the morning and were in a kind of trance during the attack. Surprised by the amount of hostilities, the Dutch tried to win over the hearts and minds of the local population, because they also feared a larger Muslim rebellion throughout the whole of the archipelago. The main mosque of Kota Raja that was destroyed was rebuilt in 1881. Meanwhile, Acehnese rebel leaders looked for outside support. Abdurrahman az-Zahir played an important role, but later bailed out as he accepted a free passage to Mecca and a load of money. And this will show that the Acehnese warlords were still very divided, despite having a common enemy. However, Muslims, both within the Dutch East Indies and outside, and were in favor of the Acehnese effort in their struggle against the Dutch, it never resulted in a large-scale Muslim rebellion within the Dutch East Indies. In 1878, the Dutch launched another series of attacks in Kota Raja, also known as Banda Aceh, and its surroundings, as well as in the coastal area Simpang Olim. With 3,000 men, led by General Karel van der Heijden, they entered the northeastern coastal area of Samalenga. Marching 30 kilometers inland, local rulers, well, they signed treaties with the Dutch. They had no other option, but the population kept resenting the Dutch, and also large-scale destruction caused by the Dutch fueled anger among the local population that were willing to fight against the infidels. Near Banda Aceh, Van der Heijden, who had lost one eye storming the mountain fort of Bate Ilik and was from then on nicknamed General One Eye, marched 13 kilometers from the capital and destroyed 400 to 500 kampongs, villages. These punitive expeditions did not quell the violence. The in 1883 newly appointed Minister of Colonial Affairs concluded that the harsh actions of the Dutch only increased the resentment and the bitterness among the Acehnese population that was now willing to fight till the end. And in 1885 reports came that resistance had only increased instead of decreased. And this could lead to a budget deficit for the Dutch. They decided on a new strategy. The Dutch decided to build a concentrated line with 16 forts around a 50 square kilometer area. Each fort would be manned by 60 to 160 soldiers, and these forts would be connected by rail. Banda Aceh, Kota Raja, was surrounded with an iron fence with guardhouses. Both the kraton and the coastal place Olele transformed into forts. Total manpower was 6,000. Now this tactic was similar to what the Dutch had applied during the Java War 1825-1830 against Prince Diponegoro. But the main difference was that during the Java War, the Dutch expanded their control over the island. Gradually, the Dutch now basically stayed within the concentrated line. They wanted to keep a small area safe. Regions outside this perimeter were left unchecked, with the exception of Idi, Sigli, northeast coast, and Molabok, the west coast. Other ports were simply blockaded by Dutch ships, but with only 25 ships, this was not possible. Posts that were abandoned by the Dutch were immediately taken over by the Acehnese warriors, and those who had collaborated with the Dutch were severely punished. For 10 years, there was a status quo. The Dutch had locked themselves in a prison of their own, because that was what the area inside the perimeter was. Venturing outside the perimeter was way too dangerous. But attacks on the perimeter kept occurring. They never stopped. And also disease claimed lives among the Dutch colonial forces. So let's take a look at the resistance of Aceh. There were basically two groups. One feudal group and a more religious group. The latter group was led by Chikdi Tiro. By 1878, he had formed different combat groups and had even deserters of the KNL in his ranks. With religious calls, he tried to rally people to his side. Do not be deceived by the power of the disbelievers, their wealth, their tools, and their good soldiers compared to our might. For none is mighty, and none bestows defeat or victory but Allah. At the height of his power, Chikdi Tiro managed to rally 6,000 soldiers, and despite heavy losses on Dutch positions, the Dutch could never feel at ease. Every time they could be attacked by warriors that came out of nowhere. They also managed to blow up railway buildings. One deserter of the KNL had managed to give them dynamite, which they now used against the Dutch. In 1890, another expedition force was sent. 1,560 men. They ventured outside the area, they set ablaze many villages and also killed 80 enemies. Chikdi Tiro died in 1891. His descendants continued the struggle. Two persons then entered the scene to advise the Dutch on what to do. One was a Dutch scholar from Leiden, Christiaan Snouck Hurgronje. He was an expert in Oriental cultures and had visited Mecca as a Muslim, where he had spoken to pilgrims from Aceh. Snouck Hurgronje advised respect towards Islam, but repression against its deviant politics. And this inspired the Dutch government, basically tolerate the moderate and combat the extreme. The second person that came to the scene was an experienced army officer, Johannes Benedictus van Heuts. He stated, "The Aceh War is gnawing at our colonial property. It must end. Let us finally show the civilized world that we are capable of this." Van Heuts advocated fair governance versus crackdown on resistance. And so, in the 1890s, the Dutch left their defensive strategy. And they did this with a new formation, named Korps Marechaussee te voet. These were well-trained gendarmeries that were armed with a klewang, a saber, and a carbine. Their mission was to venture outside the perimeter and chase the rebels and take them out. As a result of this, the Acehnese warriors from now on were more hesitant to attack the Dutch posts because they knew they could be chased by well-trained gendarmeries. Then Teuku Umar came to the scene. He was an Acehnese warlord and was willing to work with the Dutch. After the death of Cheikh de Tito, he hoped he could be the next sultan. He offered his help to the Dutch and asked for weapons to combat rival groups, and within a year he had purged large areas of enemy resistance. He also gained economic advantages. Now do notice that there is also a whole economic side of the story, also in regard with neighboring British Malaya. In this video I'll mostly focus on the military side. Now, despite the success of Umar, Snouck Hurgronje warned the Dutch government that he might one day betray them. And that happened in 1896, 2 days after he was given large quantities of weapons and ammunition, as well as cash. He basically attacked the Dutch posts and surrounded them. Dutch General Vetter was sent to the area with 2,000 soldiers. With huge losses, the Dutch managed to retake some of their posts. Posts that were hard to defend were abandoned. Then Vetter ordered his men to move inland, and in the following year, countless of villages went up in flames. In areas that were razed, tens of thousands of people were forced to flee and atrocities were committed. But it didn't end there. The Dutch, they wanted to end the hostilities, especially since petroleum sources were discovered near Aceh. And they needed a stable Aceh to make the exploitation of these sources lucrative. In 1898, Van Heuts became civil and military governor of Aceh. He vowed to take down the enemy warlords of the region. Those who resisted would be crushed. Yet, those who were willing to cooperate with the Dutch could count on protection. Van Heuts ordered that only the houses of resistance fighters should be burned down. The red rooster method, basically burning down whole villages, was abandoned. In the same year, Van Heuts personally led an expedition force to Pedir. From there, the troops moved up to the coast, from Sambalanga to Telok Semawe. A series of battles were fought. During a raid at night, the Dutch managed to capture some of the rebel leaders, but the main ringleaders were missing. Leader Umar died in 1899 during an ambush. His wife, Chutniok Dien, continued the resistance. Eventually she was captured and exiled to Java. She's now featured on one of the Indonesian banknotes. In 1901, Van Heuts marched on the religious center of Batae Ilik in Sambalanga and managed to capture this stronghold. When resistance seemed futile, one Acehnese warrior took a torch and ignited the gunpowder stash, blowing up himself and 70 of his fellow warriors. After the capture of this place, Van Heuts made more progress. The Sultan, Muhammad Daud Syah, was eventually forced to surrender. Another leader named Polem II turned himself in. Both were not exiled, but became the new rulers, loyal to the Dutch. Van Snouck Hurgronje did not like this, because he saw how the reinstated Sultan suppressed his own population, and this did not mean the end of resistance. From the homeland and within the military, criticism arose. The war had dragged on for years now, and reports of atrocities emerged. One Dutch infantry captain asked himself how Van Heuts' deputy, Colijn, future Prime Minister of the Netherlands, could combine these actions with his Christian faith. It was claimed that killed enemy fighters were mutilated. People were tortured, houses where fire came from were riddled by bullets, as a result of this killing women and children. Van Heuts called this slander. In 1905 he was succeeded by Colonel Gotfried Coenraad Ernst van Daalen, not to be confused with the earlier mentioned Van Daalen. Now this Van Daalen was known as a bloodhound. He had a deep resentment for the indigenous population, and Van Daalen was determined to crush resistance ruthlessly by all means necessary. From February till July 1904, Van Daalen led a mission to the Gayo, Alas and Batak lands. At its peak, the mission counted 1,500 men. Hunger and disease claimed lives. Fighting was sporadic. The Dutch had much better weapons. Battles became massacres, as one veteran recalled. Step by step, the kampong had to be taken. During the very dangerous work, it was often possible to spare women and children. However, several times the gendarmerie had to shoot women and children out of self-defense if they stabbed with lances or attacked with cold steel. Even children of at most 7 years old walked towards the soldiers with a big knife. On the 18th of March, the Dutch fired more than 2,300 bullets. 288 inhabitants died, of which 92 women and 28 children. More lives were lost at Coenraad on the 14th of June. 313 men, 189 women and 59 children. Photos of this massacre were taken. Despite the civilian casualties, Van Daalen was satisfied. One eyewitness reported, "Upon our inquiry, people told us that the population had sworn an oath to fight to the last man, and that they themselves, while sending up prayers, had dug their pits of death in which they and the families wanted to stand their ground or die." One Dutch commander later confessed that there was a spirit of bewilderment among his men. At one instance, he had even to threat to shoot at his own men because they did not stop firing their rifles. In one area where the KNL was operational, 30% of the population had died, which came down to 3,000 people, while only 35 KNL fighters were killed. Now, one thing I must mention is the following. In 1907, it became clear to the Dutch public what had been going on during Van Dalen's expeditions, and the public was outraged. Van Daalen was compared to the notorious Duke Alva, the time of the 80 Years' War. Cartoons appeared in papers, and in one paper a Dutch veteran named Van Oorschot wrote about his experiences. He wrote how heads were being cut off, prisoners were tortured, and people were shot for fun like, and I quote, monkeys from a tree. He also noted that the KNIL destroyed the local infrastructure of houses, roads and bridges, as well as natural resources and food supplies. Van Oorschot spoke about a deliberate attempt to wipe out the population. This led to heated debates in parliament. Van Daalen eventually resigned, but he was never punished for his actions. He always claimed that his actions were necessary for peace in Aceh. But peace in Aceh was not achieved. The situation remained unstable. For the Dutch, it remained a situation where they could be attacked at any time from any position. In 1904, 160 men of the gendarmerie were ambushed by 300 opponents and the whole unit was wiped out. By killing or capturing the main rebel ringleaders, the Dutch considered the war over in 1913. And however violence decreased, it never fully stopped. Between 1910 and 1920, hundreds of so-called Aceh murders took place, where Dutch officials and sometimes even their relatives were killed by mentally disturbed men. There were also many suicides, and most likely this was due to the trauma caused by the disruption of society due to the Dutch war. An insane asylum was founded in Sabang, and most of the inmates came from Aceh. And a lasting peace was not achieved. The Dutch continued to bribe local heads who then suppressed the local population, who then rose against them, and then the Dutch had to use force to suppress the resistance. The son and grandson of Chick di Tito were killed in action, and in 1913 the main resistance leader was killed, but hostilities never ceased. The hatred against the Dutch, against their taxes, the forced labor system, and many Acehnese that had died over the course of the years remained. Between 1924 and 29, the Marechaussee had come into action 40 times, and attacks and acts of sabotage continued till World War II. Why the war against the Sultanate of Aceh lasted so long was due to different factors. First, there was the resilience of the Acehnese resistance fighters that were willing to fight and die for their cause. Second was the mistake the Dutch made, actually on more occasions, the deployment of troops that was too small. This fueled the confidence of the Acehnese rebels, who were therefore more motivated to carry on the struggle. Third was the stream of weaponry to Aceh. There were weapon deliveries from British-controlled Malaya. The Dutch asked the British to halt these deliveries. They also blockaded ports of Aceh, but this had only limited success. Also, the Arabs and the Chinese were willing to provide weapons to the Sultanate. And then there were also the factors of the KNIL that brought their weapons over to the side of the Sultanate. The Dutch were never able to win the hearts and minds of the people because they resorted too often to extreme violence that killed many Acehnese men, women, and children. Looking at the period 1873-1942, an estimated 37,000 persons on the Dutch side died. These were soldiers killed in action, but also soldiers and forced laborers that died due to disease. Between 60 and 75,000 Acehnese died in a colonial war that had lasted for almost half a century. Did the Aceh War ever end under Dutch rule? Well, the Dutch themselves, they considered the war over in 1913. But violence kept occurring all the way till the end of 1941, when the Japanese invasion of the Dutch East Indies started. When World War II was over, the Indonesian War of Independence started. And the Dutch, they had their hands full in other areas of the Indonesian archipelago to fight against the Indonesian independence fighters. They did not even bother to restore colonial order in Aceh. Later in the 1970s, the Free Aceh movement emerged that initiated an insurrection against the Indonesian government. This more or less ended when the tsunami disaster of 2004 struck the province. I visited Aceh in 2016 and I met friendly and hospitable people. One man I met there spoke the following words: "Back then we were ruled by the Dutch. Now we are ruled by Java. Things haven't changed." Well, at least there is peace now, and let's hope that remains. If you want to learn about the Japanese invasion of the Dutch East Indies, I have the full story for you right here, and here my video about the Dutch colonial army. Thank you for watching. See you later.